Listen to that rhythm. You know, anything you do, rhythm. Now take sewing, for instance. Janice and her fingertips. And when you have that, you can turn out a perfect garment every time. We're going to show you how to make a skirt using a printed pattern. A printed pattern takes half the work out of sewing because it tells you exactly what to do, and therefore makes it easier for you to get that rhythm. The envelope shows 3 ways to make the skirt. So the first thing is to decide which style to make. Janice chose this one. Now it's very important to get the right size pattern too. Then there's much less fitting to do. This pattern is cut in waist sizes 24 to 38. Skirt patterns are bought by waist measure, unless the hips measure more than 10 inches larger than the waist. In that case, buy by the hip measure shown on the pattern and alter the waistline to fit. So before buying the pattern, we took Janice's waist measure, 26, and her hip measure, 35, and wrote them down on the measurement chart in her sewing book. Her hip measurement was just 9 inches larger than her waist, so she bought by waist measure. Now, another thing the pattern envelope told Janice was what fabrics would make up well in her chosen style. On the envelope back is a list of suggested fabrics. Now, this is the fabric she chose, a sturdy cotton. Easy to sew on, easy to press, and it'll wear well in that day-by-day use she intends to give it. Now, what told her how much material to buy? That same pattern envelope. On the back, she found her size and the width of the material. Where the 2 columns meet, it shows how much fabric is needed. Let's see what else it tells. While Janice is pressing the creases out of her pattern, I'd like to introduce a real friend. It's the instruction sheet, or as this pattern calls it, the primmer. Janice tells me she always reads the primmer before starting to work because it's so full of information that makes sewing easier and helps her to get that rhythm. Now, up here are all the things to do before you start to cut. For instance, to alter the pattern, if necessary, before cutting out the garment. Nobody likes to have a lot of fitting and readjustment to do on a garment, and if you alter your pattern, you won't have to. So it's a good idea to compare your measurements with the pattern measurements and see if it needs alterations. It's very easy to find the pattern measurements. You measure from seam line to seam line, and as you see, the seam lines are clearly printed on each. When she's ready to lay her pattern on her fabric, she again refers to the primmer. These diagrams show how each piece is to be placed, and she finds the one for her style in her pattern size and width of material, and circles it like this for easy reference. Janice's diagram shows that the material is to be folded on the width with right sides together. Now, right here in the primmer is an explanation of the construction symbols printed on the pattern pieces. A very important symbol is this straight line with arrows at the ends, the straight grain of fabric line. When you lay your pattern on the material, that line must be placed on the straight grain of the fabric. Janice, will you show how you use that line when you place your pattern pieces? She places it so each end is the same distance from the selvage. See, she's measuring to be sure. Then anchors the ends of the line with pins. Now she knows her pattern is on the correct grain of the fabric. If necessary, you can overlap the margins outside the cutting line on 2 pieces of pattern. These margins fall away as you cut out the pieces. How does she know where to cut? See this sharp, clear cutting line? And see these arrows printed on the seam line? She cuts right on the cutting line and in the direction indicated by the printed arrows. Direction of cutting makes a big difference in the look of the finished garment. When you cut and when you stitch too, it must always be done with the fabric grain if you expect your garment to hang properly. And those printed arrows point in the direction that is with the grain. Marking is done right after cutting, and it's easy because all the places to be marked are printed right on the pattern. For instance, the pocket location of Janice's skirt. Following the directions in the primer, she puts a sheet of dressmaker's tracing paper face down between the pattern and top layer of fabric, and a second sheet face up underneath the bottom layer. Then just runs a tracing wheel over the printed lines, and the pocket location is clearly marked on the wrong side of the skirt. In addition to marking all construction points, Janice also marks the width of the seams at both ends, 5/8 of an inch. You know, this primer doesn't leave one single thing to guesswork. Every step of the way is made clear with written directions and pictures. And Janice follows these directions and first stay stitches. And by the way, she'll use contrasting thread in all her stitching so you can see it better. Stay stitching is done with the regular machine stitch at the waistline and at the center back opening where the zipper goes, so the edges won't stretch when the material is handled. To stay stitch, she puts the needle into the seam allowance, 1/8 of an inch from the actual seam line. Her seam gauge is now 1/2 inch from the needle. And of course she stay stitches in the direction indicated by the printed arrows, from sides to center at the waistline, and from lower to upper end of back opening. Now would you like to learn another of Janice's pet tricks? You remember she marked her fabric on the wrong side. When she needs any of these markings on the right side, such as the pocket location, she base stitches with the machine's longest stitch right over the traced line. Then on the right side, the pocket location looks like this. The long stitches are easily removed when the pocket is finished. Next, Janice matched the notches numbered 1, stitched the center front seam from the hem up, and pressed it open the same way. Then she faced the pocket and trimmed the seams, and turned it right side out and pressed it. Now she consults her primer again and is told to top stitch the pocket flap and then straight across the pocket, 1/2 inch below the fold line which she has pressed in. She then pins the pocket along the machine-basted location line and top stitches it to the skirt. Next step, says the primer, is to join the center back seam from the bottom to the notch and then to machine-baste the placket opening together. After pressing the whole back seam open, Janice put in the zipper. The primer also told her how to do that. Stitched up the side seams, and now is ready to put on the waistband. On the long, unnotched edge of the band, she pressed the seam allowance to the wrong side. Now she clips the skirt waistline, pins the wrong side of the skirt to the right side of the waistband, matching notches, centers and sides, stitches and trims the seam, and presses it up. Then, with right sides together, Janice folded the band lengthwise, stitched the ends, and now trims the end seams. She next turned the band right side out and pressed it, and now is top stitching it on the edge over the waistline seam. A piece of grosgrain ribbon 1 1/4 inches wide will stiffen the waistband so it won't roll down. On the inside, she stitched one edge of the ribbon to the waistband, 1/8 of an inch from the upper edge, turning in the ends. Now on the outside, she top stitches right through the waistline seam, being careful not to catch in the edge of the waistband. Next, the buttonhole was made, and the buttons sewed to waistband and pocket flaps. The last step is to put in the hem. I marked an even length for her, and then she turned up the skirt along the marks and pressed the turned edge. Now she's measuring and trimming an even depth for the hem. The raw edge is then turned under and stitched on this material. If it were a heavy wool, Janice would machine stitch the raw edge with a long stitch or apply seam tape flat to the edge. Finally, the hem is pinned and hemmed in place. Now, wasn't that easy? And it was such fun to do. Now, here's Janice in her skirt. Her aunt, and her cousin in the other two styles you saw on the pattern envelope. I'm sure any of you can make any or all of these skirts just as easily as Janice did if you just let your printed pattern tell you what to do.